In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Chengdu, where the streets hummed more with the sound of bicycles than cars, there lived an 8-year-old girl who saw the world differently, not through words or pictures but through music. Every morning before school, while most kids were still rubbing sleep from their eyes or scrambling to find a matching sock, she was already at the piano. It wasn't a grand instrument, just a second-hand upright her parents had bought from a neighbor who was moving away. The keys were slightly yellowed, one of the pedals squeaked, and the high C had a faint buzz when pressed too hard. But to her it was perfect. She didn't need an alarm clock. The soft morning light filtering through the thin curtains was enough. She'd slip out of bed, tiptoe past her parents' room so as not to wake them, and pad barefoot across the cool tile floor to the living room. There she'd lift the heavy fallboard with both hands, sit on the worn cushion her grandmother had stitched years ago, and begin. No warm-up exercises, no metronome ticking away like a stern schoolteacher, just her fingers meeting the keys as if greeting an old friend. What came out wasn't just notes strung together. It was feeling. Sometimes it was joy, bright, skipping melodies that danced like sunlight on water. Other times it was something deeper, something she couldn't name but clearly felt. A slow, aching phrase that seemed to ask a question no one had answered yet. Her parents would often wake to the sound of Chopin drifting through the walls, or a Beethoven sonata played with a tenderness that made her mother pause while folding laundry, her hands stilling mid-motion. Her father, an electrical engineer who spent his days troubleshooting circuit boards, once admitted he didn't understand half the music she played. But when she plays, he'd say, stirring his tea slowly, it's like the whole house breathes differently. Her mother, a software developer who rarely took breaks during her workday, started scheduling her coffee at 7:15 a.m., not because she needed caffeine, but because that's when the piano usually began its morning song. No one had forced her to play. In fact, it had started almost by accident. When she was 4, her parents had signed her up for a local music class just to keep her occupied during summer break. The teacher handed out tiny xylophones and tambourines, but this girl had wandered over to the old piano in the corner and pressed a single key. Then another. Within minutes, she was copying the simple tune the teacher had just played on the recorder. The instructor was stunned. She's never had a lesson, her mother explained, half apologetic. But the teacher just smiled and said some children don't need lessons. They just need permission to listen. From that day on, the piano became her language. While other kids chattered about cartoons or playground games, she'd sit quietly, her mind clearly somewhere else, replaying a melody in her head, working out a tricky rhythm with her fingers tapping against her thigh. She didn't talk much about how she learned pieces. When asked, she'd just shrug and say, I hear it, then I try it. That was it. No flashcards, no drills, no pressure. Just listening, feeling, and trying. Her parents never pushed her to perform. They weren't stage parents dreaming of fame or trophies. They were practical people who believed in balance, homework first, chores second, piano whenever the mood struck. They'd seen enough child prodigy stories on the news to know how quickly wonder could turn into pressure, and they were determined to protect her joy. So they never filmed her playing for social media. They didn't enter her in competitions. They simply let her be. But even in their quiet home, her talent was impossible to ignore. Neighbors began stopping by under the pretense of borrowing sugar or asking about the weather, just to hear her play. The elderly woman downstairs, who rarely left her apartment, started leaving handwritten notes in their mailbox. Your daughter's music made my day brighter. A delivery man once lingered at the door longer than necessary, hat in hand, saying, I don't know much about piano, but that sounded like heaven. At school, she was just another kid, quiet, polite, always raising her hand before speaking. She didn't brag about her piano skills, and most classmates didn't even know she played. During music class, when everyone fumbled through Twinkle Twinkle on recorders, she kept her head down and played along like the rest. Only once during a school assembly did she step into the spotlight. The music teacher, knowing her secret, had gently asked if she'd play something short for the end-of-year celebration. She agreed, but only if she could choose the piece. That afternoon, she walked onto the stage in her plain blue dress, sat at the old-school piano, and played a gentle arrangement of Clair de Lune. The gymnasium, usually echoing with shouts and squeaky sneakers, fell completely silent. Even the principal stopped shuffling his papers. When she finished, there was a beat of stillness, then thunderous applause. But she didn't smile or bow. She just stood up, gave a small nod, and walked back to her seat as if she'd just returned a library book. After that, a few kids asked her to teach them piano. She tried, patiently showing finger positions and counting beats, but quickly realized she didn't know how to explain what came so naturally to her. "It just feels right," she'd say, frustrated. Like when you know which shoe goes on which foot. Eventually, she stopped offering lessons and went back to playing alone. Still, her love for music only grew. She'd listen to recordings on her parents' old tablet. Glenn Gould humming along to Bach, Martha Argerich attacking a Rachmaninoff concerto like a storm, and lie in bed imagining herself on stage. Not for the applause, but for the chance to share that feeling. She didn't dream of fame. She dreamed of connection, of playing something so true that someone somewhere would feel less alone. Her room was filled with scribbled sheets of music she'd tried to write down herself. Most were messy, with smudged pencil marks and arrows pointing to corrections. She didn't read music fluently yet. She learned mostly by ear. But she was slowly teaching herself notation, using library books and YouTube tutorials her dad downloaded during his lunch breaks. "Why do you want to write it down?" he once asked. "You already know it." She looked up from her notebook and said, "Because someday I might forget, and I don't want to lose it." Weekends were her favorite. No school, no schedule, just hours at the piano. Sometimes she'd improvise, making up stories with her hands. A cat chasing butterflies, a boat lost in fog, a conversation between raindrops. Other times she'd tackle a new piece she'd heard on the radio or in a movie. Her current obsession was a fast, jazzy piece she'd caught in a documentary about New York City. It had wild rhythms and sudden stops that made her laugh out loud the first time she heard it. She'd been working on it for weeks, slowing it down in her head, practicing one measure at a time. Her parents watched her, amazed not just by her skill but by her focus. While other children bounced from one activity to the next, drawing, then video games, then building blocks, she could sit at the piano for 2 hours straight, completely absorbed. She didn't get frustrated when she made mistakes. She'd just pause, listen, try again. "It's like she's having a conversation with the music," her mother once told a friend over tea. "And she won't stop until they understand each other." One rainy afternoon, when the sky was gray and the streets were empty, she played for 3 straight hours. Her parents didn't interrupt. They just sat in the kitchen, sipping warm soup, letting the music fill the house like a warm blanket. At one point, her father looked at his wife and whispered, "Do you ever wonder if she's different?" Not in a bad way, just in the way that some people are born with a compass pointing towards something the rest of us can't see. She wasn't perfect. She forgot her lunch twice a week. She left her socks everywhere. She cried when her favorite stuffed rabbit lost an ear. Her mother sewed it back on with red thread, which now stood out like a tiny badge of honor. She loved mango ice cream, hated broccoli, and always insisted on wearing mismatched socks on Fridays, for luck. She was, in every other way, just a regular 8-year-old girl. But when her fingers touched the piano keys, something shifted. Time slowed. The ordinary became extraordinary. And in that small living room with its peeling wallpaper and secondhand furniture, magic happened. Not the kind with sparkles and wands, but the quiet, human kind that comes from deep listening, pure curiosity, and a heart wide open. No one knew it yet, but that piano, creaky, imperfect, beloved, was about to carry her far beyond their neighborhood. Not because she wanted to leave, but because the world has a way of noticing light, even when it's shining quietly in a corner. And soon, someone would knock on their door with an invitation that would test not just her talent, but the very thing that made her music so special, her joy. For now, though she didn't think about any of that, she just played, because it felt like breathing, like laughing, like coming home. And in a world that often moved too fast, too loud, too harsh, her music was a gentle reminder that wonder still existed, one note at a time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a flyer for a local dumpling shop. It was crisp, cream-colored, with elegant lettering that looked nothing like the usual mail that came to their apartment. Her mother almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another advertisement. But something about the seal, a small golden emblem of a piano, made her pause. She opened it, artfully, her fingers brushing the thick paper as if it might dissolve. Inside was an invitation, Not just any invitation, but one to the National Youth Piano Showcase in Shanghai. It was a prestigious event held once a year, where the country's most promising young musicians gathered to perform, learn, and sometimes, if they were lucky, be noticed by teachers from top conservatories. The letter explained that her daughter had been nominated by her music school, a rare honor, and that if she chose to participate, she would be given a 5-minute slot to play before a panel of respected judges. Her mother read it twice, then called her husband into the kitchen. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, listening as she read the letter aloud. When she finished, there was a long silence. They both knew what this meant. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about opportunity. But it was also about cost, time, and risk. Shanghai was over 1,000 miles away. Train tickets weren't cheap, especially for 3 people. And the showcase didn't cover lodging. They'd need to find a place to stay, even if just for one night. On top of that, her father had a big project at work with a tight deadline, and her mother had just taken on extra hours to help with a system upgrade. Money was tight. Every yuan counted. That evening, after dinner, they sat their daughter down. They didn't mention the letter right away. Instead, they asked how her day was, what she'd played that afternoon, whether she'd finished her math homework. Then gently, her mother placed the invitation on the table and explained what it was. The girl picked it up, her eyes scanning the words slowly. She didn't jump up and down. She didn't beg to go. She just sat there, quiet, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. Finally, she looked up and asked, "Do I have to?" Her parents exchanged a glance. "No," her father said. "It's your choice. You don't have to do anything you don't want to." She nodded, then asked, "Will there be other kids like me?" "Probably," her mother said. "Kids who love piano." She thought for a moment longer, then handed the letter back. "Okay, I'll go, just like that. No drama, no demands, just a quiet yes." But her parents didn't say yes right away. That night, after she'd gone to bed, they stayed up late talking in hushed voices at the kitchen table. They weighed the pros and the cons. Was it fair to spend so much on one trip? What if she got nervous and didn't enjoy it? What if she felt out of place among children trained in elite academies with private tutors and custom-made pianos? On the other hand, what if this was her chance? Not for fame, not for a career, but just to see that she wasn't alone, that there were others who heard the world in melodies and felt rhythms in their bones. In the end, they decided to try. Not because they expected anything grand, but because they believed in her joy, and they didn't want fear of cost or distance to dim it. They booked the cheapest train tickets they could find, hard seats, not sleepers, and reserved a tiny room in a guest house near the venue, the kind with shared bathrooms and thin walls. They packed light, 1 small suitcase for all 3 of them, a thermos of tea, snacks for the journey, and her stuffed rabbit, now slightly frayed but still full of love. The morning of the trip, she wore a dress her aunt had sent last year for Chinese New Year, navy blue with tiny white flowers. It was a little big, but her mother pinned it at the shoulders so it wouldn't slip. She insisted on wearing her favorite red socks, the ones with the stars, and refused to wear shoes until they were at the station. "My feet need to breathe," she said seriously, and her parents didn't argue. The train ride was long, over 12 hours. At first, she pressed her face against the window, watching rice fields and villages blur past. She counted bridges, pointed out cows, and tried to guess how many people lived in each town they passed. But as the hours wore on, she grew quiet. She curled up in her seat, rabbit in her lap, and closed her eyes. Not sleeping, just listening. To the clack of the tracks, the hum of the engine, the murmur of other passengers. She was gathering sounds, storing them away as she always did. Her parents watched her, hearts full and heavy at the same time. They wanted to protect her from disappointment, from judgment, from the sharp edges of the world. But they also knew they couldn't wrap her in bubble wrap forever. Sometimes you have to let someone step into the light, even if it's blinding at first. When they finally arrived in Shanghai, the city hit them like a wave. Bright lights, tall buildings, crowds moving fast like schools of fish. The noise was constant. Honking, shouting, music from street vendors. It was overwhelming, especially after their quiet neighborhood back home. Her father held her hand tightly as they navigated the subway, her mother double-checking the map on her phone every few minutes. The guest house was exactly as advertised, small, clean, and no frills. Their room had two narrow beds and a window that looked out onto a laundry line strung between buildings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs for the night. They dropped their bags, washed up, and went out to find dinner. Steaming buns from a street stall. Sweet tofu pudding for dessert. Back at the room, her mother laid out the dress for the next day and checked the time of the audition. "You don't have to play anything fancy," she reminded gently. "Just play what feels right." The girl nodded. She wasn't practicing out loud. There was no piano in the guest house, but her fingers moved silently against her knees, rehearsing passages in her mind. She'd chosen a piece she loved, a lyrical Chopin nocturne, soft and flowing like moonlight on water. She'd played it 100 times at home. She knew it in her sleep, but that night she barely slept. Not from nerves, but from the sheer newness of everything. The sounds of the city outside, the unfamiliar mattress, the weight of tomorrow. She lay awake, listening to her parents' steady breathing, clutching her rabbit like an anchor. Morning came too soon. They ate a quick breakfast of congee from a nearby shop, then walked to the venue. A grand old building with tall columns and a marble lobby. Inside it was hushed like a library. Children in crisp outfits waited with their parents, some flipping through sheet music, others pacing quietly. A few were warming up on practice keyboards set up in the hallway, their fingers flying over the keys with robotic precision. She stood near the wall, eyes wide. She'd never seen so many pianos or so many serious faces. One boy, maybe 10 years old, was muttering scales under his breath like a prayer. A girl in a red dress sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead as if preparing for battle. Her parents stayed close, offering quiet words of encouragement, but they didn't push. They knew this was her moment, not theirs. When her number was called, her heart didn't race. She wasn't scared. She was curious. What would the piano sound like here? Would the acoustics be warm or cold? Would the judges listen with their ears or with their hearts? She walked into the audition room alone as the rules required. The space was smaller than she expected, with tall windows letting in soft daylight. In the center stood a gleaming black grand piano, far fancier than her upright at home. 3 judges sat at a table to the side, pens in hand, faces unreadable. She bowed slightly as her teacher had taught her, then sat at the bench. She adjusted it just a little and placed her hands above the keys. For a moment she closed her eyes, not to pray but to remember. Her living room. The squeaky pedal, the way the afternoon sun hit the keys just right. The quiet joy of playing for no one but herself. Then she began. The Chopin poured out of her like a secret finally told. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight hesitation in the middle, a note softer than intended, but it was honest. Every phrase carried feeling, not just technique. She wasn't trying to impress. She was sharing. When she finished, the room was silent for a beat too long. Then the head judge nodded and said, "Thank you. That was lovely." She bowed again and walked out, her red socks peeking beneath the dress. Back in the hallway, her parents waited. They didn't ask how it went. They could see it in her eyes. She was already back in her own world, replaying the sound of that grand piano in her mind. They didn't win a trophy that day. No one handed her a medal or announced her name over a loudspeaker. But as they walked back to the guest house, her father carrying the suitcase and her mother holding her hand, she looked up at the Shanghai skyline and said, "The piano here sings louder." Her parents smiled. They didn't know it yet, but that simple trip, those train rides, that tiny room, that 5-minute performance had planted a seed. Not for fame, not for competition, but for confidence. She had stepped into a world that felt foreign and returned unchanged in the ways that mattered, but changed in the ways that counted. And though they'd soon board the train back home, carrying nothing but tired feet and a heart full of new sounds, they had no idea that this quiet audition would ripple far beyond that room, because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones with crowds and cameras, but the ones where a child dares to play her truth in a room full of strangers, and is heard. The audition room felt different this time, not because anything had changed in the space itself, but because the air had grown heavier, thicker with expectation. It was the second round of the showcase, and only a handful of young pianists had been invited back. The girl hadn't expected to be among them. When her number was called the day before, she'd assumed it was a mistake. But here she was again, Stan. Ding just outside the tall wooden doors, her fingers lightly brushing the fabric of her dress, her stuffed rabbit tucked safely in her mother's bag. Inside, the three judges sat in the same positions as before, but their expressions were sharper now, more focused. The first judge, the one who'd thanked her so gently after her Chopin, was a woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She'd spent 40 years teaching at one of the country's top music schools and had heard thousands of young players. The second was a man with round glasses and a calm demeanor. He'd once been a concert pianist himself before an injury ended his performing career. Now he judged competitions and wrote about music for a national magazine. The third was younger, perhaps in his late 40s, with a reputation for being tough but fair. He rarely smiled during auditions, not out of meanness, but because he believed music should speak for itself. No applause, no praise, just truth. They'd listened to polished performances all morning. A boy from Beijing played a technically flawless Liszt piece, his fingers moving like lightning. A girl from Guangzhou delivered a delicate Mozart sonata with perfect posture and timing. Each performance was impressive in its own way. Disciplined, precise, clearly the result of years of rigorous training. But as the hours passed, the judges began to feel a quiet fatigue. Not physical tiredness, but the kind that comes when everything starts to sound the same. Notes were hit correctly, rhythms kept steady, dynamics followed. But something was missing. The spark, the soul. By early afternoon, they needed a change. They wanted to test something beyond memorization and muscle memory. So they reached into a folder of sheet music they rarely used, pieces meant not for performance but for challenge. The head judge pulled out a single page, an etude by Nikolai Kapustin, a composer who blended classical structure with jazz improvisation. This particular piece was fast, syncopated, full of unexpected accents and shifting time signatures. It wasn't something you could fake. You either understood its language or you stumbled. "Let's try this for sight reading," the head judge said, sliding the sheet across the table. The other two nodded. It was a fair test. Sight reading revealed how deeply a musician truly listened, not just to what was written, but to the spirit behind the notes. When the girl walked in, she looked smaller than the day before, as if the grandeur of the building had shrunk her a little. She wore the same navy dress, now slightly wrinkled from being folded in a suitcase. Her red socks were still on and her hair was tied back with a plain black band. She bowed just as before, then waited. The head judge smiled warmly. "We'd like you to try something new," she said, holding up the sheet music. "It's a short piece. Just read it as best you can. Don't worry about being perfect." The girl stepped forward and took the paper. It was printed in crisp black ink, dense with notes that seemed to jump and twist across the staff. To most 8-year-olds, it would look like a tangled mess. Even many adult pianists would hesitate. She looked at it. Once. Just a single glance. Her eyes moving quickly from left to right, taking in the shape of the phrases, the clusters of notes, the strange rhythms marked with slashes and dots. Then she handed the paper back. The judges exchanged puzzled looks. Had she even read it? But she was already walking toward the piano. She sat, adjusted the bench, placed her hands over the keys, and then, without a breath, without a pause, she played. Not a timid attempt. Not a cautious start. She played the opening phrase exactly as written, a bright swinging jazz line with a crisp left-hand chord that landed like a heartbeat. The rhythm was spot on, the articulation sharp yet fluid, the phrasing alive with the swagger Kapustin had intended. It lasted only 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds the room changed. The man with the glasses froze mid-sip of his tea. The younger judge leaned forward so suddenly his chair creaked. The head judge's pen slipped from her fingers and rolled across the table. Silence followed, not the polite silence of an audience waiting to applaud, but the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. She didn't stop. She kept going, playing the next few bars with the same ease as if she'd known this music her whole life. Her fingers bounced off the keys with a lightness that made the complex rhythms feel natural, even playful. There was no strain, no guessing, just pure, instinctive understanding. When she reached the end of the excerpt, about a minute in, she lifted her hands and turned slightly in the bench, her expression calm, almost curious. "Should I play it again slower?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The head judge blinked as if waking from a dream. You've never seen that piece before?" She finally managed. The girl shook her head. "No, I just looked at it, but how?" She shrugged. It sounded like something I heard once, on the radio, or maybe in a movie. She paused, thinking. It feels like rain on a city street. Fast, but happy. The three judges sat in silence for a long moment. They'd heard prodigies before, children who could mimic, who could memorize, who could dazzle with speed. But this was different. This wasn't imitation. This was translation. She hadn't just read the notes. She'd understood their soul. The younger judge, the one who rarely spoke during auditions, cleared his throat. Do you know who Capiston is? She shook her head again. No, but I like how his music moves. He looked at his colleagues, then back at her. That piece is considered extremely difficult, even for conservatory students. She didn't seem to know what to say to that. So she just smiled, a small, shy smile, and said, it didn't feel hard. And that was the truth. To her, music wasn't about difficulty. It was about listening. If you listened closely enough, the notes told you what to do. They whispered where to press, how fast to go, when to hold back. She didn't think in terms of scales or chords or time signatures. She thought in colors and weather and stories. This piece was a rainy afternoon in a big city, with people hurrying under umbrellas, laughing, splashing through puddles. Of course it should swing. Of course it should bounce. The head judge finally found her voice. Thank you, she said, her tone softer now, almost reverent. That was remarkable. The girl bowed again, then walked out, her red socks silent on the polished floor. Back in the hallway, her parents waited, unaware of what had just happened. They saw her come out looking the same as always, calm, quiet, a little tired, and assumed it had been another ordinary round. How'd it go? Her father asked, crouching to her level. They gave me a new song to try, she said simply. I liked it. Her mother smoothed a wrinkle from her dress. That's good. Ready to go home? She nodded. They didn't stay for the results. They hadn't come for awards. They'd come because she'd said yes, and now it was time to return to their quiet life. Their creaky piano, their familiar streets. But inside the audition room, the judges remained seated long after she'd left. The sheet music still lay on the table, untouched. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, the man with the glasses said, I've been judging for 23 years. I've never seen anything like that. The younger judge nodded slowly. It wasn't just skill. It was intuition. Like she was born hearing that language. The head judge picked up her pen and wrote something in her notebook. Not a score, but a single sentence. She doesn't play the piano. The piano plays through her. They knew right then that they'd witnessed something rare. Not just talent, but a kind of musical empathy that couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. And though they would go on to hear more performances that day, more flawless runs, more dramatic crescendos, none of them would forget those 3 seconds. 3 seconds that held more truth than hours of practiced perfection. As for the girl, she never thought much about it afterward. On the train ride home, she fell asleep against her mother's shoulder, her rabbit tucked under her arm. She dreamed not of judges or grand pianos, but of her own upright at home, waiting patiently in the living room, ready to sing with her again. She didn't know it yet. But those 3 seconds were about to echo far beyond that room. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones that are planned or polished, but the ones that happen when someone simply listens and dares to respond. The video started with shaky phone footage, grainy, slightly out of focus, the kind someone records quickly without thinking. It showed the back of a small figure in a navy blue dress walking into a grand room with tall windows and a gleaming black piano. The camera panned to the judges' table, where 3 adults sat with pens and serious faces. Then came the voice of someone whispering off-screen. This is the 8-year-old from Chengdu. They just gave her Kapustin. She's never seen it before. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. Her hands touched the keys. The opening phrase burst out, bright, swinging, alive. The camera zoomed in slightly as the person filming gasped. Just a soft "oh," and the sound of a pen clattering to the floor echoed faintly in the background. The clip ended right after she turned and asked, "Should I play it again slower?" It was uploaded that same night by a staff member who'd been cleaning the hallway and happened to peek through the door. He didn't post it for fame. He posted it because he couldn't stop replaying it in his head. You have to hear this, he wrote in the caption. An 8-year-old just read Kapustin like it was nursery rhyme. By morning it'd be... and shared over 10,000 times. People weren't just watching, they were reacting. Comments flooded in from musicians, teachers, parents, even people who'd never listened to classical music in their lives. "Is this real?" one asked. "I've been playing piano for 20 years and I can't sight read that," wrote another. A jazz pianist in New York commented, "She didn't just play the notes, she got the groove." That's not something you teach. That's something you feel. Within 48 hours, the video had over 1 million views. News outlets picked it up. Headlines read, "Child prodigy stuns judges with impossible piano feat and 3 seconds that broke the internet." Talk shows reached out. Music schools sent letters. A famous conductor in Europe even wrote a personal note saying he'd never seen such natural musicality in someone so young. But back in Chengdu, none of this had reached the small apartment yet. The family had just returned from their trip, tired but content. The girl was already back at her piano, playing softly, reacquainting herself with the familiar squeak of the pedal and the warm tone of her own keys. Her parents were unpacking, washing clothes, trying to return to normal life. They didn't check social media much. They didn't know their quiet daughter had just become a sensation. It was the music teacher who called first. "Have you seen it?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "Seen what?" her mother replied, folding a towel. "The video. From the showcase. It's everywhere." Confused, her mother opened her phone and searched. When she found the clip, she watched it 3 times in a row, her hands covering her mouth by the second viewing. She called her husband into the room. He stood behind her, arms crossed, silent until the end. Then he just said, "That's our girl." They showed the video to their daughter that evening. She watched it with mild curiosity, as if observing someone else. "Oh," she said when it ended. "That's the piece." She didn't seem impressed. To her, it was just another moment of playing, nothing more, nothing less. But the world outside didn't see it that way. Offers began arriving by email, by letter, even by courier. A prestigious conservatory in Beijing offered a full scholarship, starting immediately. A talent agency proposed managing her career, arranging concerts across Asia and Europe. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow her for a year. A piano manufacturer offered to send a brand new grand piano free for her to keep. Her parents read every message carefully. They thanked each sender politely, but they didn't say yes to any of them, not because they were ungrateful, but because they remembered why they'd gone to Shanghai in the first place, not for fame, not for opportunity, but because their daughter had said, "Okay, I'll go." And that okay had been quiet, honest, unburdened by expectation. They knew what happened to child prodigies. They'd seen the stories: burnout, pressure, lost childhoods, broken spirits. They didn't want her music to become a product, a performance, a brand. They wanted it to stay what it had always been, her voice. So they made a decision together as a family. They would protect her joy above all else. They declined the scholarship, explaining that she was happy in her current school and needed time to grow at her own pace. They turned down the agency, saying they weren't ready for that kind of path. They politely refused the piano, though they were touched, because her old upright was part of her story. And they told the filmmaker, maybe someday, but not now. Instead, they did something quieter. They called her music teacher and asked if they could arrange a small recital just for neighbors, friends, and classmates. No cameras, no press, no pressure. Just music shared in a familiar space. The teacher loved the idea. They booked the community center on a Saturday afternoon. Chairs were set up in a loose circle. Someone brought cookies. The girl wore her everyday clothes, jeans and a t-shirt with a cat on it, and played barefoot just as she always did at home. She didn't play Capiston. She played pieces she loved, a gentle Bach convention, a playful Schumann scene, and a short improvisation she'd made up that week about a butterfly lost in the rain. When she finished, people clapped, not wildly but warmly, like you do for someone who's shared something real. Afterward, an elderly neighbor approached her. "Thank you," she said, eyes glistening. "My husband used to play piano. He passed last year. Hearing you, it felt like he was here again." The girl didn't know what to say, so she just hugged the woman, and in that hug something clicked. This was why she played. Not for judges, not for videos, not for fame, but for moments like this, for connection. Back home, her parents watched her as she curled up on the couch with her rabbit, flipping through a library book about composers. She seemed the same as always, calm, thoughtful, a little dreamy. But they noticed something new in her eyes. Not pride, not excitement, but understanding. She was beginning to see that her music could touch people in ways she hadn't imagined. Still, life went on as usual. She went to school. She did her homework. She argued with her parents about eating vegetables. She practiced piano every morning, not because she had to, but because it felt like breathing. But the world hadn't forgotten. Months later, a letter arrived from the Shanghai Conservatory, not an offer but an invitation. The head judge from the showcase had recommended her for a special workshop, a weekend gathering of young musicians from across the country, focused not on competition, but on collaboration. There would be no auditions, no rankings, just playing together, learning from each other, sharing ideas. This time, her parents didn't hesitate. They said yes because this wasn't about being the best. It was about belonging. When the weekend came, she traveled with her teacher this time, not her parents. She was nervous, not about playing, but about meeting other kids who loved music as much as she did. Would they understand her quiet way? Would they think she was strange for talking to her stuffed rabbit before performances? But from the first moment, she felt at ease. The other children weren't there to show off. They were there to listen. One boy played the violin with his eyes closed, swaying like a tree in the wind. A girl from the mountains brought a bamboo flute and taught everyone a folk song her grandmother had sung to her. They played duets, made up songs together, stayed up late talking about which composers made them cry. And when it was her turn to play, she chose the Kapustin, not to prove anything, but because she wanted to share the joy she'd found in it. This time she played it with a little more swing, a little more smile. And when she finished, the other kids didn't clap right away. They just sat in silence for a moment as if holding the last note in their hearts. Then one of them said, "Teach me how you hear it like that." She didn't know how to explain, so she just sat beside him at the piano and played the first phrase slowly, showing him how the rhythm bounced, how the left hand grounded the right. He tried it, missed a note, laughed, tried again. In that moment, she realized something important. Music wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to be shared. When she returned home, she didn't talk much about the weekend. But her parents noticed she practiced differently now, sometimes playing along with recordings, sometimes inviting her teacher to play four hands with her. She was still quiet, still dreamy, but there was a new lightness in her playing, as if she'd discovered that music didn't have to be a solo journey. The viral video faded from the news cycle. New stories took its place. But for those who'd seen it, the memory lingered, not of a prodigy, but of a child who reminded them what music was really about. Listening, feeling, and daring to respond with your whole heart. And in her small apartment, with the creaky piano and the afternoon sun streaming through the window, she kept playing, not for the world, but for the joy of it. Because in the end, that's where the magic had always lived. Not in 3 seconds of fame, but in the quiet daily act of showing up, listening deeply and letting the music speak through you. Years passed, as they always do. Quietly at first, then all at once. The girl who once played barefoot on a creaky upright in a modest apartment was now a teenager. Taller, more thoughtful, but still carrying that same quiet spark in her eyes. The stuffed rabbit, now missing one eye and held together by countless stitches, still sat on her piano bench, though she didn't need it for courage anymore. She'd found her own. The viral moment from the showcase had long faded from headlines. The internet had moved on to newer wonders, flashier talents, louder voices. But in certain corners of the music world, people still spoke of that audition, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. A reminder that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. She never became a child star. There were no world tours, no glossy magazine covers, no reality TV deals. Her parents had kept their promise. They protected her joy. And in doing so, they gave her something far more valuable than fame. They gave her time. Time to grow, to stumble, to change her mind, to fall in love with music all over again on her own terms. She stayed in school, not a conservatory. She took regular classes, math, history, science, and still groaned about homework like any other kid. She joined the school choir, not as a soloist, but as one voice among many. She even tried playing guitar for a while, just to see what it felt like to make music with something other than piano keys. She liked it, but her fingers missed the weight of the hammers, the resonance of wood and wire. At home, the old upright was still there, though it had been tuned more regularly now. A local piano technician who'd seen the video years ago offered to maintain it for free. "It's not every day you see an instrument become part of someone's soul," he'd said with a smile. She appreciated the care, but she never treated the piano like a relic. She spilled tea on it once, doodled on the music stand, left sheet music scattered like fallen leaves. It was a living thing, not a museum piece. Her playing changed over the years, not because she chased a style, but because she lived. When her grandmother passed away, she wrote a short piece full of long silences and unresolved chords. When she made her first real friend in high school, a boy who loved poetry and hated math, they composed a duet together, piano and spoken word, for a school talent show. It wasn't polished, but it was honest, and the audience sat in stunned silence before bursting into applause. She still listened to Glenn Gould and Martha Argerich, but now she also listened to street musicians, folk singers, jazz trios and smoky cafes, even the hum of the subway. She'd learned that music wasn't confined to concert halls or sheet music. It was everywhere, if you were willing to hear it, and she never forgot that audition in Shanghai. Not as her big break, but as a turning point. Not because of the judges' stunned faces or the 3 seconds that went viral, but because of what came after. The quiet understanding that her gift wasn't just for her. It was a bridge. That realization deepened when she turned 16. Her music teacher, now retired but still full of fire, suggested she volunteer at a community center that offered free music lessons to underprivileged kids. "You don't have to teach technique," she said. "Just show them that music can be a friend." At first she was nervous. She remembered how awkward she'd felt trying to explain piano to classmates years ago. But this was different. These kids didn't care about scales or sight reading. They just wanted to make noise that felt good. So she showed them how to find melodies in everyday sounds. The rhythm of rain, the beat of footsteps, the lullaby of a lullaby. She let them bang on the keys, then gently guided them toward patterns. She didn't correct every mistake. She asked, "How did that feel?" instead of "Was that right?" One boy, barely 7, had never touched a piano before. He pressed a single key over and over, fascinated by the sound. She sat beside him and played a simple harmony underneath. His eyes lit up. "It sounds like my mom singing," he whispered. She didn't say anything. She just kept playing, letting the moment breathe. That day she understood something her younger self had only sensed. Music isn't about being the best. It's about being present. Her parents watched all this with quiet pride. They never bragged about her. They didn't post videos of her performances online. But sometimes, late at night, her father would sit in the dark living room just to listen to her practice. And her mother, now working remotely, would leave her office door open so the music could drift in while she coded. They'd made sacrifices, of course. They'd said no to opportunities that could have brought money or recognition. But they never regretted it. Because the girl they raised wasn't a product. She was a person, curious, kind, still a little shy, but deeply connected to the world through sound. Then came the invitation that surprised even them. A small international music festival in Europe, one known not for competition, but for collaboration, asked if she'd be willing to perform. Not as a prodigy, not as a sensation, but as a young artist with a unique voice. They'd heard about her through a teacher who'd attended the Shanghai workshop years ago. They didn't want flashy technique. They wanted honesty. This time her parents didn't hesitate. They knew she was ready, not because she was perfect, but because she knew why she played. She chose her own program. No Kapustin this time. Instead, she selected pieces that told a story. A Bach prelude for clarity, a Chopin nocturne for longing, and her own composition, a short, wordless piece called 3 Seconds, inspired not by the viral moment, but by the silence that followed it. The silence where everything changed. The night of the performance, she walked onto the stage in simple clothes. Dark pants, a soft white shirt, no shoes. The audience was small, intimate, filled with musicians and listeners who valued depth over dazzle. She sat at the piano, placed her hands above the keys and closed her eyes, not to block out the world, but to welcome it in. When she played, it wasn't about showing off. It was about sharing. Every note carried the weight of her journey. The quiet mornings at home, the train ride to Shanghai, the stunned silence of judges, the laughter of kids at the community center. The memory of her grandmother's voice. It was all there, woven into the music. Afterward, people didn't rush to take photos or ask for autographs. They stayed in their seats quiet as if waking from a dream. One elderly woman approached her backstage, tears in her eyes. "You played like you were telling the truth," she said. "And the world needs more of that." On the flight home, she looked out the window at the clouds below and thought about how far she'd come, not in miles, but in understanding. She realized now that those 3 seconds in Shanghai hadn't been about speed or skill. They'd been about trust. Trust in herself, trust in the music, trust that if you listen deeply enough, you'll know what to do. Back in Chengdu, life returned to its gentle rhythm. She went back to school, back to the community center, back to her old piano with its squeaky pedal and yellowed keys. She still practiced every morning, still left socks everywhere, still hated broccoli. But something had shifted inside her. Not in a dramatic way, but like a river changing course over time. She no longer wondered if she was good enough. She knew that music wasn't about measuring up. It was about showing up, with your whole heart, your whole self, your whole truth. Years later, when she was asked in an interview what that audition meant to her, she didn't call it her breakthrough. She smiled softly and said, "It was the moment I learned that music can stop time, even if just for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, something timeless happened. Not because a child played fast, but because she played true." Today, she still plays. Not for crowds, not for cameras, but for anyone willing to listen. And in a world that often feels loud, rushed, and disconnected, her music remains a quiet invitation to slow down, to feel deeply, and to remember that sometimes the most powerful things happen not in grand gestures, but in small, honest moments like a child at a piano, listening and daring to respond.